Okay, it is now recording, and we can finish up where we left off, finish talking about chapter 19, and set a nice foundation to then go backwards and talk about chapter 18. Which is always fun, but I think this way makes a lot more sense than the way that the text does it. We have a couple holdouts that need to finish their exam, and they are both going to finish it today, at which point then I can hand back exams. And so you should anticipate getting your exam back on Wednesday, in case you were wondering when it was going to happen. That's why I do exams on Friday, because I like to give them back to you on Monday, so you only have the weekend to worry and be anxious. But when there are people that don't take it on Friday, it does complicate things a little bit. It makes my weekend way better, because then I don't have to grade over the weekend. I just wait until all the exams are done and then just sit down and, knock them out. But so that's a little bit of an expectation of what's to come. This week we'll do chapter 18 starting on Wednesday, and hopefully we should have a good chunk of time to do our discussion Fridays. And so I know I wasn't here this last Friday while you were taking your exam. I should be here this Friday. It is getting kind of fun to not show up when you guys have exams and just start my weekend early. But I don't know if that's going to continue or not. Who knows? I can't predict the future. Next week we are not going to cover any material because I'm going to be feasting, and probably you are as well. In youth group, we meet on Tuesday nights. I told them we're not even going to go over a lesson that week. We're just going to feast together. And so that way I can just draw Thanksgiving out over the whole week. Who wants to just use a single day when you can use a whole week? You're welcome. And I think that's it as far as announcement. I mean, we're doing pretty well. We're on pace to get to all of the material we're supposed to during this semester, which is always good when you can accomplish that. We may, miss a couple of points, but it should be okay. Plus, we're ending talking about ecology, and y'all don't care about ecology, so it's all good if we have a couple of points that we don't quite get to. I think that's it as far as announcements. Unless, does anybody have something they feel like they need to share with the class? Sorry, my mouth is really dry. You want to share that with the class?
Free hot cocoa in the bookstore today.
Free hot cocoa in the bookstore today.
I felt like I bonded with Joseph over the weekend.
Did you?
It was a very good bonding time.
That's good. I call him Joey, so I don't know who you're talking about with Joseph. My mouth is really dry, and so I may have to pause even more than normal to take drinks because I had to fill a tube with spit for 23andMe. So just kind of a heads up. That really doesn't mean a whole bunch to you. But my mouth is really dry. So yeah, does somebody want to pray for us to save me some words as we start? Somebody wants to pray. Somebody wants to pray. All right, Caleb.
Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day and for just the chance we have to come back together again in a new week and study biology. And I just pray that our conversation today would be edifying and that we would be open to learning and just attentive, and that our minds would be firing on all cylinders, and that we'd be able to just absorb all the information and comprehend it well. Thank you for Dr. Abel and for this class, and just pray that we would use this time to glorify you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. All right, so we left off last time talking about when does a population not stay at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And I mentioned to you that it is virtually impossible to meet the assumptions of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, right? First assumption is population is infinitely large. First of all, I don't even understand what that means, let alone to try to meet it. And yet, most populations do not depart from Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, where if you know the allele frequencies, you can predict the genotype frequencies really, really close to what they actually are. And that's fantastic and strange and wonderful. So we left off talking about if it is not at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, so you know the allele frequencies, you know the genotype frequencies, and something doesn't match, then you can go and figure out which of these 5 forces is it that's actually shifting your population away from Hardy-Weinberg. Yeah.
Why does it have to be an infinite population?
That's an excellent question. It has something to do with the way the model works. I'm guessing that it has to do with I don't know the underlying mathematics to how the model works. I know how to use the model, but I don't know how it was constructed. So I'm assuming that it has to do with how the mathematical formula was constructed. That you need an infinite number for something. Yeah. So we talked about five forces that will shift a population away from Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. The first one we mentioned was drift and is random genetic changes, right? And then we mentioned gene flow, individuals leaving or entering the population and shifting the allele frequencies. We also mentioned mutations, and then we mentioned two types of selection, and what are those? Sexual selection and natural selection, okay? Oftentimes, those two forces work in opposition to one another. And so our next framing question is, of these five forces, which is most powerful? Which force should we care the most about? Which force should we think the most about? And more importantly, most importantly, which force should we suspect is at play whenever a population is not at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium? To make this answer a little bit more complicated, is we're basically going to answer this and say, well, it's complicated. So which forces are most powerful? It's complicated. It depends on some underlying features of the population. So the strength of the force depends on a number of factors. One of those factors is population size. And this actually gives us a great opportunity to talk about something that we oftentimes use and we don't think about as much as we ought to. And that's the idea of rarity. When you refer to an organism as rare, what are you actually talking about? Okay, and this isn't written on the slide, but it's a good thing to talk about. It'll come back up when we talk about ecology. But there are basically three measurements of rarity. If you refer to an organism as being rare, or as, you might think of it as potentially endangered or potentially threatened, there are basically three measures of rarity. One is that the population size is small, or all of their population sizes are small if there are multiple populations of that organism. So that's one aspect of rarity, if there are few individuals in their populations. Another aspect of rarity is if they're not a widespread species, like their distribution is pretty narrow. They tend to be restricted to a specific place. And the other measurement of rarity is basically how specialized are they? What's the variety of different resources that they can use? And so if you have organisms that are very specialized and can only survive when certain features are present, we would still refer to that as rare, even if there are a bunch of them. Or if their distribution is really focused in a specific place, we would still refer to that as rare, even if, again, there are a bunch of them. And so there are three ideas of rarity. Population size is probably the most important. In small populations, drift is by far the most powerful force. And we probably could have answered this question simply, and I don't actually have this written as on the slide, is it's almost always drift. Almost always drift is the most powerful of these five forces. Almost always. But especially in small populations. And we mentioned this last time, so if you have a bottleneck event and a lot of your population dies, not only do you lose a lot of the variation, but it's also subject to further drift. We also mentioned last time that red hair is disappearing due to drift, and you all mourned. And I know it's probably spent a good deal of time recovering from that. I mean, you can do your part. I mean, you can do your part by marrying somebody with red hair. So, number of alleles. When few alleles are present, anything that can introduce new alleles is going to be really powerful. So gene flow and mutations are both going to be really powerful if you have very little genetic variation. Like, let's say your entire population has a single allele, like for whatever that gene is. And now you're like, well, drift, it's not really going to be all that powerful because you can't get a random genetic change when you only have one feature present, right? You can't really change the allele frequencies. But in that situation, gene flow and mutations that can introduce variation, those are going to be really powerful if you have very few alleles, especially if by very few you only have one. Only have one allele. When there's a large amount of variation, natural selection can be the most powerful, but only if also your population is really big. We'll come back to that, right? Because if the population is small, genetic drift's going to be the most powerful, regardless of the other features. Unless, of course, you only have one allele. But anyways, make sense? So if you have a lot of variation to play with, and your population is pretty big, natural selection can be the strongest force. But we'll talk about what needs to be in place for natural selection to play out. Dispersal patterns. So in species that disperse well, that is, the offspring can travel long distances, gene flow can connect widely separated populations and can be the most powerful force. If you've got a species where the offspring really travel long distances, you can be constantly introducing new alleles and can make that a very powerful force. Yeah, go ahead.
Next, 2 questions. What creates a recessive gene?
What creates a recessive gene? So the answer to that is most often it is some kind of a mutation.
That makes it recessive?
Yes. So most often the recessive allele is recessive because it is not making whatever that product is supposed to be, right? So the dominant allele, it's making something, right? Mm-hmm. It's a code for something to be made that they can then do some action, and so oftentimes the recessive allele is a malfunctioned gene that doesn't actually make any product. And the reason why it's recessive is because if you have one copy of the normal, the dominant, then it overshadows that you have one form that's not making it because you have one form that is.
So then, like with red hair, the original redhead.
Well, red hair's not that simple. So red hair's not technically a recessive trait. It gets masked if you deposit a lot of melanin. It's a different pigment altogether.
Okay.
So instead of melanin, it's a different pigment. So it can be masked, but you could still be a redhead and not even know it because you've masked it with brown hair. You've masked it with hair that's dark enough to cover it.
So that original ancestor to whatever species has that, what would it have had? I mean, a bunch of dominant alleles that became not so dominant later on due to mutations?
Yeah, with red hair, I think what you're looking at there is just some inherent variation that is no longer present. That in humans used to have a wider variation of pigments, because you have that in other mammals, a wider variety of pigments. And I think you're looking at a remnant of that. They used to have a wider variety of pigments that many of which have disappeared because of drift.
And then also, how long does it take for different recessive genes and alleles to disappear in a population?
Depends on the size of the population and how that factor actually impacts the population. So if it's deleterious, like it's negative, it has a bad impact on the individual with that trait, it can go pretty fast.
Because I'm thinking if long Earth versus short Earth, man, if there are a lot of negative, not negative, but a lot of recessive alleles in the population, it should, if population's hundreds of thousands of years old, then it should have.
Yeah, when you study population genetics, time can oftentimes be a bigger enemy than it is a friend. Because you tend to accumulate bad mutations every generation that you just can't completely weed out. And so over time, those build up and actually, ultimately can lead to the extinction of a species because of a buildup of bad mutations, bad forms of genes that you couldn't weed out. Yeah. We'll come back to that. All right, the last one, sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism and sexual selection are positively correlated. So in species where there's what's called sexual dimorphism, the males look different than the females, sexual selection is a powerful force. But sexual selection is what actually helps maintain that dimorphism and maybe help to build it in the first place. And so these tend to be correlated. Does one cause the other? It's hard to say, but they tend to go hand in hand. So if you have sexual dimorphism, the males look different than the females. And this isn't talking about like the males are on average a little bit bigger Okay, this is talking about like extreme sexual dimorphism. Like males are vibrant in color and females are drab, gray. I combined gray and drab, or grab. Yeah.
I actually forgot to ask this last week, but so is it only physical features that are considered mutations, or that can be mutations, or
No, it can be behaviors. Yeah.
so mental disorders can also be
Sure.
considered?
Yeah, absolutely. And even behaviors. Like there are certain behaviors that are very clearly influenced by a single gene, and you can have mutation and recessive traits there that lead to higher probabilities of certain behaviors. It's more complex in humans because we seem to be unique in our ability to overcome our programming, but you still see it. Yeah. But yeah, the recessive condition could refer to behaviors as well, not just physical features. Yeah, that's a good question. All right, so this is an image that, and actually the next several that come out of the last section of the text, which I don't think is a good place to put them. But this, you have a what's called the side-blotched lizard, and you basically have 3 different morphs for males. You have an orange morph, so you've got an orange-throated male, you have a blue-throated male, and you have a yellow-throated male. And I forget which one is the dominant, but you have either the blue or the orange are the dominant males. Like they're polygynous. They have a harem of female lizards, and then either whichever one's left, the orange or the blue, whichever one is the polygynous male, is what's called a satellite male. They just hang out near the dominant male and try to sneak copulations. And then you have a third morph that's the yellow-throated that looks like females. They look like the females. The males have no idea that they're even there. And so they hang out amongst the females, and then they get their genes to the next generation that way. And so it's balanced. It's a balanced polymorphism that remains that way because of sexual selection. Females prefer the dominant males, but then you have 2 other male morphs that are able to sneak copulations. And then here are some extreme cases of sexual dimorphism. And again, it's not like the males are on average bigger than the female. Technically, that's sexual dimorphism, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about where you have a wildly different form. And so here's a peacock versus a peahen, very different morphologically. Here's a male garden spider versus the female garden spider. Here's a male, this is a wood duck, I think. Is that a mouse? Yeah, it's a wood duck. And then the female wood duck. And so when you find these sexual dimorphisms, they go hand in hand with really strong sexual selection. So whenever you see that in a species, you have to know that sexual selection is really strong in that species. Yeah.
Wait, isn't it true that like some spiders, like after they mate, the female will eat the male?
Yeah, I don't know if most, but many spider species are that way. Yeah, it's an expensive task making thousands of eggs. And so the males, and in the species where the females don't eat the males usually bring some kind of what's called a nuptial gift, like a huge meal for her to partake in that she didn't have to work for, to provide the energy necessary to lay those eggs.
So part of like the female eating the male is like, I'm gonna need a lot more.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So,
Yep. Yeah. Plus, she doesn't want the male to eat the eggs that she puts into an egg sac, which
because the male would do that.
possibly, yeah, oftentimes, yeah. All right. So our second to last question, and is evolution adaptive? So in the text, they put all of the information about sexual selection, minus just introducing it, into the section on adaptive evolution. It's a horrible way of thinking about it. I mean, just horrible. Now, what you have to realize is that when you're talking about adaptive, and we'll mention this in a little bit, things get a little bit tricky about what you're actually talking about, and that's why sometimes you can slip sexual selection in there as adaptive, but don't think that way. It's a bad way of thinking. Don't fall into the trap that the authors of the textbook did. So how is evolution adaptive? As a reminder, mentioned this when we talked about natural selection, it is the survival of the fittest. Then there's a question, well, what does that mean to be fittest? To be the most fit. To be the most fit. And here's basically this idea. Those that are most able to survive and form viable offspring leave the biggest impact on the gene pool. So those that are most able to survive and form viable offspring, and that's important, viable offspring. So offspring that can reproduce themselves. Doesn't do you any good if you form a lot of offspring if they're all sterile. Leave the biggest impact on the gene pool. So that's what we talk about as being most fit. And so if you're talking about a species with a great deal of sexual selection, if the males have some kind of feature that allows them to have more offspring, well, yeah, then you could try to slip that in as adaptive evolution, but then what does that actually help to accomplish by making that species better equipped for its environment? And the answer is nothing. And so I think it's a hard sell to try to sell that as adaptive. I mean, sure, it may make the males better able to make more offspring, but it doesn't actually help the species survive better in its environment. Anyways, keep that in mind. So over time, this is under natural selection, more individuals of the population should have whatever that fit feature is. Whatever that feature is of the fit individuals. This is the idea of natural selection. So keep in mind that you had to already have some individuals that were more fit than others, right? And then over time, more individuals of that population have that fit form. Okay, so the textbook introduces something that's important to talk about, and that's in situations where the phenotype, whatever that feature is, and again, this could be behavioral, to answer your question, Jacob. The phenotype doesn't have to just be what you see, it could be also what you experience, could be something behavioral. But if that phenotype varies over a spectrum, that is, there's not like three, unique groups, like it's either brown, white, or black, It's like, no, if it's more of a continuum, like there's all values are possible, then what you tend to find is that natural selection on that phenotype tends to occur in one of three forms. One is stabilizing. And so in stabilizing selection, the whatever that mean, that average value doesn't change. And I'll show you an image of this. Whatever that average value is doesn't change, more of the population has it. Okay? So if you're going to use human height as an example, human height is a great thing to illustrate varying over a spectrum, right? It's not like everybody's either 5'5", 6 foot, 6'5", 7 foot, right? It's a full continuum there. And so in stabilizing selection, let's say the average American male is 5'10.5", which I think is what the average American male is. And so in stabilizing selection, that average would not change, just a greater percentage of the population would have that average value. You'd lose some of your variation. So in stabilized selection, you're losing some of the variation. Then you have disruptive. So in disruptive, man, my values got all messed up. Oh man, so disruptive, your average does not change, but fewer individuals have that average characteristic. Okay, so instead of having a nice bell-shaped curve where the average is 5'10", you would get kind of a double bell, where you'd have a lot of short individuals and a lot of tall. Okay, that's the idea of disruptive, but your mean value doesn't change. Wow, is it really going to bring it in all the way at the beginning, all the way at the end? That is really disappointing. I'm sorry if you watch back on this and this bothers you, just know it bothers me too. It's not right. So yeah, something that is also true to bring up is some phenotypes are actually successful because they're rare. This is especially true in species that are under enormous amounts of predatory pressure. Sometimes something is selected just because it's really rare and predators don't know to look for it. And that may be the only advantage it gives them in their particular environment. Yeah.
What's the third?
I'll bring it. So I have to do our lecture break question, and there it is. Directional. So directional is the only one that actually changes that middle value. It's the only one that changes whatever that average value is. So in directional selection, using human height as an example again, human height, the average human height would be getting shorter or would be getting taller. That's the idea of directional selection. And so oftentimes what you find here is that this produces extremes that you didn't see before. So you actually start to get people getting taller and taller and taller and taller than you never saw before because your average is shifting up So your extremes are going to get even taller, right? Or if your average is shifting down, you could get people even shorter than what you had before. So this is the only one that's actually going to produce new forms, things you didn't see before. Yeah.
So, say when there's a chimera and it mates with another one, how would that go into play with the alleles?
Yeah, so if you had an organism that, are you talking about like something that's a morph of two different species? And then mating with another individual that's a morph of two different species? It's usually going to just increase the amount of variation. If they're still capable of reproducing together, their genetics are similar enough that you're not usually talking about unique genes, just forms that don't exist in a particular species. So it tends to add to the variation. Yeah, that's a good question. All right, so here's our lecture break question. So as you embark on this, get yourselves into groups of 6/7/8. Get yourselves a discussion leader and a representative. What are some of the factors necessary for natural selection? So first of all, I want you to buy into that natural selection is the only one of those 5 forces that's actually adaptive. And what we mean by that is where it actually makes the species better equipped to thrive in their environment. Because you have more of the individuals that have that fit characteristic, or in the condition of directional selection, you're actually producing novel conditions, right? Things that are even taller than you ever had before. And if there's some advantage for being taller, obviously getting taller than you've ever seen before is really nice, right? Really nice. And so as you think through this, and as you think about natural selection being the only adaptive force, what do you have to have for natural selection to actually work? Okay? To have it to where it's even remotely powerful. And I mentioned some of it in the previous slide. You can go back to that as you're thinking through and addressing this question, and then you could just think through some other things. So take a couple of minutes, get yourselves into a group of 6/7/8, get yourself a discussion leader, and get yourself a representative. All right? Take 2 minutes, starting now.
Huh? Okay. All right. So, I guess we'll just kind of go down the line then. So, what are some of the factors necessary then?
Well, the way you mentioned in the slide
We'll go, yeah, that way.
was there has to be a large number of alleles.
Yeah.
Variation.
So it has to have some pick one.
Yeah. Enough variation in the alleles for that to even be possible.
I would say either the species to either there has to be death, so the animals actually have to die, or if they can't, in addition to, they need to be able to migrate because in order to weed out animals that are not suitable for their environment, the ones that aren't suitable need to leave either by death or migration.
Okay.
So natural selection prior to us in the fall could have happened via migration because that wouldn't necessarily die.
Yeah.
So you need to either have migration
Or for that, if the whole population, because it would be, yeah, there would be some that might go off and migrate and die off that way.
Okay, so there's the
But for that, it would be either the whole population kind of migrating off into a new environment and certain individuals having an allele that makes them better suited for that environment than other individuals. And so those individuals would die off in that new environment, giving rise to a species with
weed
better
out.
alleles. Yeah.
Weed out the ones with less beneficial.
Yep. Noah, what do you have?
I mean, I agree with what you guys are saying.
Yeah. Okay.
That's a really cancer.
So in other words, one feature
The original.
actually
There's some
needs
effective selection.
survival.
There's got to be environmental factors.
Mhm.
Pressure on the species,
Yeah.
it's got to be factors in there.
Okay. That's good.
Yeah.
So we have to reproduce
Environmental stress.
Yeah, so that's
features
probably.
beneficial.
Kimmy, what do you have?
More and more individuals are dying off. What does that require?
Yeah.
Either be really successful or
Okay. So like,
I thought back to something that we learned at the beginning of the semester.
Yeah.
All right, take about 10 more seconds. If you don't have a representative, get one.
Who wants to be a representative? No, yeah, what were you saying?
I
Russ?
was saying there needs to be more
Share,
population.
just share those.
Survive.
Yes. Yeah,
say?
there needs to be more in a population that can survive than those that won't, in order for the population to continue on. Who wants to represent?
Oh, my top versus resources too. Yeah, okay.
Who hasn't done it
So,
before?
All right.
reproduction.
Charles, I think do you want to represent?
So, first off, and I mentioned this a little bit ago, but Darwin and Wallace, very close to each other, published this idea of survival of the fittest, of where there's just some individuals that survive better and reproduce better, and so over time, the population starts to look a lot more like those individuals, and as you weed out some deleterious things, you could get some change over time, where the population actually has some novel features. Okay, maybe some novel coloration patterns, or heights you never saw before, or producing litters bigger than they'd ever produced before. Things like that. Up to that point, the idea of how organisms changed over time was a Lamarckian idea. Which basically boiled down to this. So if over your life you developed enormous strength, so you have people will kind of poke fun at Lamarckian ideas and say, well, if you're a bodybuilder, right? And then you have children, your children are going to be stronger on average than a person's children who wasn't a bodybuilder, because you kind of develop these features that then you could pass on to your kids. It doesn't quite work that way, but that's kind of taking it to the extreme. But a lot of this thinking came about studying economics. So studying economics fueled a lot of these ideas of natural selection. All right? So we'll start here and then we'll make our way back and around. But give us one feature that has to be present for natural selection to work or to be possible. Just one.
Just one.
Yep. Give us your best.
Wow, we got some good ones. I would say a large variation of
A lot of variation. Good.
variation within the species in order for them to be individuals to weed out to begin with.
Sure. Yeah, and we mentioned that actually in the previous slide. I said if there are a lot of alleles, natural selection can be the most powerful force, but you better have a lot of variation in place. Okay, that's an excellent thing. Something has to be in place for natural selection to happen. You have to have a lot of variation, which is interesting because then there's a question, well, where did that variation come from? And that's why we tend to refer to it as evolution by mutations and natural selection. Providing the variation and then something to act on that variation. All right, what do we got here?
We said
Death. Good. Yeah, so more individuals born than can possibly survive. And again, this is where this idea was influenced really heavily from economics. You were starting to get to a time in many European countries where the populations were higher than what they could actually provide for regularly. And people were still having enormous amounts of children. They were going through this industrial revolution, and birth rates weren't really slowing in response to the amount of development that was actually in place now. Where you had a lot more of your offspring surviving, and people really starting to run into some issues, especially as you get to the late 1800s, early 1900s. You basically had a situation in which World War I was almost impossible to avoid because of the enormous economic pressure a lot of the European countries were under. Tying history in with natural selection ideas. Yeah.
on top of death, the organisms have to die based on based on environmental conditions.
Yeah, so maybe what you're getting at is that some individuals have to be less likely to die than others. Is that what you're getting at? Yeah, so you have to have individuals dying, and some individuals less likely to die than others because they are better equipped to meet those environmental challenges, right? That it's because of environmental pressure why those are dying. Is this all one group here? No, that is 8. All right, what do we got?
But there needs to be one beneficial feature, or not one, but kind of a beneficial feature to differentiate between two different kinds.
Sure, that there's got to be something so that is good, right? There's got to be something that makes some individual better equipped or less likely to die than others. Really, that's what you're getting at, is being better equipped or more fit means you're less likely to die and more likely to produce viable offspring. All right, so then one other factor that nobody mentioned, and it's an important one for natural selection to work, and this nobody may mention it because it may have been obvious, is that whatever that variation is, it has to be partially genetic. So it has to be heritable. You have to be able to pass it on to your children. That's a big one. And it may be one where it's like, well, duh, like if some individuals are better at surviving than others, you would imagine their children are probably going to be more likely to have whatever that feature is. Yeah, that's true, but it needs to be something that you state. Okay? So the big three are there needs to be variation. That variation needs to be heritable, like at least some of it needs to be genetic, and more individuals need to be born than can possibly survive. Yeah.
What do you mean it has to be partially genetic? Like I know.
So it doesn't have to be entirely. So like let's use human height. Human height is another great example of this.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of height has to do with your environmental conditions, right?
Okay.
If as a child you are on the verge of starvation all the time, even if you are genetically predisposed to grow to an incredible height, you probably will not be because of your malnutrition.
Okay, got it.
Right? So it needs to be at least partially genetic. That's not to say that the environment can't have any role on how it plays out,
Yeah.
but it has to be partially genetic, which tall parents tend to produce taller children, all things being equal, right?
Got it.
So yeah, it doesn't have to be entirely genetic. That is, the environment can have some impact on how it plays out. Yeah.
To add to the death thing, I would
Yep.
say death cannot be limited. It can't just be death. It can also be migration.
Right, it has to be functional death, and that's exactly what I was about to get at. So probably in the last 20 years, people have started to put a lot more effort into, can you have natural selection if individuals aren't really dying? And the thing is it needs to be functional death. That is where some individuals are not basically producing offspring, adding to the gene pool. So there's a couple ways you can accomplish that. One is you can have the individuals that are not fit for that environment leaving and going somewhere else. And so according to that population, they have functionally died, right? They are not contributing to the gene pool, so functionally they have died. And it's kind of weird to think that way. You're like, wow, like, so if I decide to leave and spend the rest of my life in a country that I didn't grow up in, functionally you've died to your country, right? And actually, if you want to become a citizen of another country, you actually have to surrender your American citizenship. Okay? So functionally, they've died. And then the other way is they could just not reproduce. And so even if they're not dying at a higher rate than other individuals, if they're not reproducing, functionally you have the same thing. They're not adding to the gene pool. And so you could have natural selection actually occur under both those, even if you are not producing more offspring than can possibly survive. And you'll see this a lot in groups where there's like a hierarchy. So you'll see it a lot in like lion prides, where you may have two males in that pride, but only one of them is producing offspring. So functionally that other male, even though he's part of there and he may not die before the other male does, functionally he's not adding to the gene pool. Make sense? Another one, naked mole rats. Great example, and they're just fantastic little animals. Hideous animals, but fantastic. You tend to have a dominant female, the queen, that rules everything, and she's the only one that reproduces, typically. So you can actually get natural selection without a great deal of death. Because this is an important thing to think through. If there was no death prior to the fall, could natural selection still work? Right? We'll come back to that in not next week, but the week after when we talk about macro evolution.
So, in cases like the mole rat where you only have one female
Yep.
breeding, would that then make if there's any other females in that population that they would be functionally dead then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Although they're better than dead because they're not adding to the gene pool and they're serving the queen. So actually better than dead. They're almost like drones and bees.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Would they?
Now they're also the daughters of the queen, typically. So
Would it be possible for then that for like a female like that to go off and start another kind of
sure,
population?
yeah,
Okay,
yep, absolutely,
got it.
yep. That's how naked mole rats tend to work. Somebody gets tired of being subservient to the queen, and she leaves and starts her own colony. Takes a couple of males with her, of course, but then starts her own colony. Or you just wait till the queen dies.
Wouldn't that limit variation within that species, though?
Oh yeah. So yeah, the relatedness in naked mole rats is obnoxiously high, like closer than normal siblings. Yeah. All right, our last framing question: why do populations maintain alleles that contribute to poor phenotypes? So if you want to put this in the context of humans, why are genetic illnesses really common even in a relatively healthy society, right? How do we maintain those? Now, humans is a little bit more interesting because natural selection is very weak on humans, right? Even sexual selection is very weak on humans, because even if if you're a really, really unhealthy person, like if you look at countries that have a really obnoxiously low life expectancy, it's still like close to 40 years, which you're like, wow, that sounds horrible. But you have to realize if you're reaching sexual maturity at 13 years old and your life expectancy is 40 years, you've got 27 years of reproductive years, right? So that's a long time. And so natural selection just tends to be relatively weak in humans. And sexual selection is as well. But anyways, so if we think about certain things like genetic illnesses, why doesn't natural selection just weed them out? Why do they stay maintained, right? Why do they stick around? So first thing you need to note, there's no such thing as a perfect population. Oh man, things as a perfect subject-verb agreement. That's horrible. Another example of you not getting the best form of myself. I'm sorry. I even did this. I went over it last night and again this morning and didn't catch that one. That's
if you
terrible.
Didn't say anything, no one would notice.
I know, but I noticed and I need to tell everybody because I feel horrible about it. It's like when you're a kid and you steal, a piece of candy out of like the bulk bins that you have to weigh. Nobody saw you, but you just feel horrible, right? You're like, how do I make this right? Of course, I didn't think like that as a kid. I was just like, sweet, free candy. But, my parents educated me and I learned. Natural selection, so the first reason for this, natural selection is limited by the present variation. So if you don't have like an incredible form, it doesn't matter, right? If it's not there, if all of your individuals have kind of just okay ways of meeting whatever the environmental stress is, there's not much you could do. You could be like, wow, this species just doesn't seem to be very good. And it's like, well, we're limited by the variation. Great example of that, panda bears. Okay, so not only are panda bears, they're really good at pulling leaves off of eucalyptus, right? And off, not eucalyptus, bamboo. Sorry, I saw you mouthing. Yeah, eucalyptus, koala bears, different place altogether. Bamboo, they're really good at that. But man, they pretty much suck at being bears. And they're really, they just, and on top of that, they do not reproduce. They don't reproduce in the wild. You can't even get them to reproduce in a zoo. And even when you try to do like artificial insemination, it just doesn't work. Like they're just so hard. It's like we're fighting so hard to try to keep an animal alive that doesn't even want to be alive. And they are cute, yeah. But yeah, it's tough, so you're limited by what variation you have in place, yeah.
Do spots on animals also depend on the alleles, or is that just random?
You mean like where the spots are or the presence of spots?
Where the spots are.
Somewhat, yeah, that's more of a developmental issue than a genetic one, yeah. But somewhat, yeah, somewhat. Another aspect why you have bad phenotypes is you have to know that genes are located on chromosomes. And so oftentimes you have two genes that are really close together. Okay? So if you have two genes that are really close together, oftentimes as that individual is making gametes, you may not be able to separate those two genes apart as you're making gametes. So what that means is if you have a bad allele for one of those genes, but the other gene has a really, really good allele, and it's a more important gene, you may have that bad allele just kind of piggybacking or riding the what's the term I'm looking for? Riding the coattails, thank you, of that good gene, right? Of that gene that's really, really important. So this is how you actually figure out if you're like, man, there's this species, and you're like, I don't really get why they behave in this way. It just seems to be really horrible. Like, it seems to be a really bad idea. And then when you go and you look at where the genetic basis for that behavior is, oftentimes it's really close to a gene that's really essential. So it's basically just riding the coattails of that good gene, and you have this bad allele that's just sticking around. You can't get rid of it because the other gene is more important. Another issue is you could have two phenotypes that are just so different that there's no way to be an intermediate form and to have any success. The textbook uses this when it talks about your field mouse example, where it talks about that there's basically two different color morphs. There's a really light morph that blends in well with the sand, but really doesn't do all that super well because most of the landscape or most of the food is actually in the wooded areas, and that light morph actually sticks out pretty well in the wooded area. And there's a dark morph that actually thrives inside of the wooded area where most of the resources are. But anything in between that does poorly in both those environments, in the open areas where there's the sand and in the wooded areas. So there's really not an intermediate form that works. And so you're really crippled with what variation is possible. And so you can't really get some really cool things going on. And then you also have to realize, lastly, that most of the evolutionary forces are not adaptive. And again, I tried to sell you on what I think is relatively obvious, that only natural selection is adaptive. It's the only one that's actually capable of making populations better equipped for their environment. Because as you weed out bad alleles, you can get the best of the best, right? It's kind of this idea of Gattaca. Have you ever seen Gattaca? If you haven't seen Gattaca, I shouldn't tell you should watch it because I think there's some instances in the movie that are not Masters approved. But I'm just putting that out there. But anyways, the idea here is almost nobody is born naturally anymore. Everybody goes to genetic counselors, and you have the absolute best of your gametes paired with the absolute best of the gametes of your spouse. And so what you end up getting is an increase in human intelligence, that you get people that are just smarter and more productive than you've ever had before, right? Because you're basically weeding out all of the bad stuff, okay? And this is kind of the idea, and this is why natural selection can be adaptive. Because if you can weed out all the bad alleles, you can actually get combinations that are better than anything you've seen before. Especially with regards to directional selection, when something varies over a continuum. You can get heights you've never achieved before, right? And if there's something advantageous to being tall, right, you can get something that just never existed before. And this is kind of the idea of where giraffes came from. Because I think it's reasonable to assume that giraffes did not exist at the point of creation. We'll use giraffes when we come back to this idea of macroevolution. We talk about it in a couple of weeks. But the idea here is there was some kind of an advantage to having a really long neck. And I think the reason why you can argue that giraffes did not exist initially is because they've got some really intriguing, interesting design that makes it look like that their necks were once a lot shorter. And then they grew really long, getting something that didn't exist before because of kind of weeding out any alleles for small necks, right? So natural selection tends to be the only one that's actually adaptive. The other four forces, remembering that almost always, which is your most powerful force? Genetic drift. And genetic drift is completely random. Completely random. And so that is almost always the most powerful force, which means almost always your most powerful force is not adaptive. That is actually, if you want, favoring things that are just random and may not be for the good of the organism. You also have to remember, this comes right out of the text, evolution has no purpose. And this is the reason why I put this is not necessarily because I think it's super duper profound. I mean, it kind of makes sense, evolution, even evolution by natural selection. Of course, there's no purpose, there's no intent behind it. You're just kind of, some individuals are surviving better and are reproducing better, and so overall your population can become better equipped for its environment. But the reason why I included this, because I think understanding this helps to really preclude theistic evolution from being an option. Because the thing is, if you want to try to sell that God directed evolution to accomplish what his goals were, it's very interesting, because that's not how evolution works. And there's not really good evidence for that. It's just, you're forcing something on evolution that just doesn't seem to be there. And of course you could argue, well, it was miraculous. It sounds a lot like kind of like a God of the gaps idea, right? So we don't know how this works, so God did it, right? You've got some really, you've got some really good and really sound data that suggests that evolution is just, there's no way it could be directed. And so it kind of, I think, precludes this idea of God directing it to accomplish something. Plus, then I think it gives you the idea that in some way we are like the hallmark of what evolution has produced, which I think that's a hard sell to make. I mean, we can do some things that other animals can't, but you know what? Bees and wasps can do some things that other animals can as well. And so I think that's a hard case to make, that in some way we are the hallmark of what evolution can produce. Okay? Unless there's something unique about us that's not biological. Right? And then that gets into something different that evolution can't act on. All right? So it's 12:36. We've got 4 minutes left of class, but I'm done. If you want to hang out and use those 4 minutes, I'll stay here. But if you don't, have a good day, and I'm not going to think any less of you if you skedaddle off and use these extra 4 minutes to nap or Russ.
The test with the questions, you might have already got this. The test with the questions,
Okay.
No, it's okay.
study guide. I'm wondering if they were in a certain way on the study guide, and I just missed it. That didn't make a sufficient study guide.
Well, so we definitely distinguished. I mean, we had a whole set of slides that were titled prototypes.
I would love to.
Cheap enough.
How much?
Right, and then a whole set of slides that were titled new.
Yeah.
And so that's where the
Yeah.
distinction was.
Like a good one for
And
people.
definitely played into every question.
Enough to print something.
So like any of the questions that
7
came
by
out of the
7 by
slides on
7.
neuter students,
7 cubed.
anything that applied to those organisms